So it's my great honor to introduce Bob Sheil as a keynote speaker this morning. Bob Sheil is a professor of design through production at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL in London, where as director from 2014 to 2022, he led significant transformation in size, resourcing, diversity, and research strengths. He's fascinated by the transgression between design, making, craft, and technology in research and practice. He is author of multiple book chapters, refereed papers, and journal articles, and have lectured internationally. So the title of his talk today is, it's not behind us, is on the FABRICATE conference that he founded from 2011 to 2024. So I'm very, very eager to see the projects. I've been at the FABRICATE conference last year in Copenhagen. No, this year. Time passes by when you've got fun and a grant to manage. Which was a fantastic conference. It was really, really interesting. So it's really, really great to have Bob today here. Thank you, Bob, for coming to Australia and presenting.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. How are you all feeling today? Yeah, I went straight to bed after yesterday's final talk. So, but I've been up since about 1 o'clock this morning. So I'm in a totally different time mentality than people here. But anyway, I'd like to just say how pleased I am to be here. And thank you to Hank and Ivana in particular for setting this all up and all the hassle, of the bookings and so on, and getting a long-distance traveller, comfortable and landed safely. Thank you very, very much indeed. It's a really wonderful thing that you're doing, Arch Manu, and it kind of relates to me in lots of different ways, which I hope to talk about over the next hour or so. This is an informal talk. It's just going to wander through quite a lot of material, so hopefully it'll be okay with you for an early morning kind of session, with all of the other discussions and questions that this symposium are bringing up, kind of floating around it in a way. I'm hoping to provide a kind of a journey through a series of works, quite a lot of work, 160 projects. I'm going to talk about them really quickly. It's not my work, and it's certainly not my position to talk about them in depth, but especially because one of the things about the talk is to show you where the deep information is, and how fluid it is. So I think that's today's timetable, and this is my first slide, and that's me. Yes, that's me. Yeah. So I'm going to just start with a few preambles about myself, and so that in case anyone feels they need to put that bit of context in place beforehand. The bulk of the talk is about other people's work, not my own. So I've heard the phrase, my background is in architecture quite a few times recently. Isn't it something we all seem to say quite a lot, or you hear being said quite a lot? My background is in architecture. I'm an architect, but my background is in architecture. I do connect with that quite a bit. My own origins in architecture started out with a very conventional education in the 1980s. And then I went into practice, and then I came back to education in the radical, inverted commas, education of the 1990s at the Bartlett, where Peter Cook and Christine Hawley turned the school on its head in about 12 months. It was a very exciting place to be and that transformation to witness. But out of that, and out of the freedom that culture gave me, I became interested in workshop-based practice and went on to follow that kind of pathway, but definitely not on my own. I've always worked in teams. And it's one of the things I think drives me to be here today and to talk about the stuff I'm going to talk about is I'm far more interested in other people's work than my own. And I like working with other people. I get that stimulation out of it. I think it's the most attractive thing about being in architecture is that you're always in a team. The project's always collaborative. But yet, that isn't always how it's presented to students in schools. There's a huge amount of focus on the individual, the expression of the individual's position, which of course is important, but for me, it's always more important to listen to the chorus and to listen to the sum of the whole being greater than its parts, and so on. So we founded what we called 16 Makers in the final year of time when we were students in the mid-1990s. We've just picked the name because we like the number 16. and we'd like to call ourselves makers, not architects. Now everyone, I mean, we're not saying we're the first people to call ourselves makers. It was a 19th century thing mainly. But we thought it carried a certain message. Certainly in the late 1990s when digital practice was emerging in architecture. Of course, we all know it's been around for nearly half a century before that. But it came into mainstream architecture through narratives that picked up its visual properties. So we were floating in cyberspace rather than being grounded in materials in a lot of cases. But of course, we do know there are very, very powerful pioneers who saw the relationship with the digital and manufacturing as being the route to redefine architectural practice. So as Hank was saying in the introduction, I'm interested in the transgressions between drawing and making. I don't regard myself to be an expert in anything, really. I've been on that kind of journey in different capacities, as a practitioner, as an educator, as a researcher, and then as someone leading a fairly busy and ambitious department. So within the kind of work itself, there's always a critique of architectural education and of practice. I'm interested in that phrase that the drawing or data is an instruction to make. What a loaded kind of concept that is, and what that means for expertise and involvement around that sort of status. I'm interested in the skills for making images and the skills for making things as being two worlds that can mesh, but they also have often been held apart. And there are moments when they're better held apart, but there's an awful lot of power in when they're together. And we go on to talk about in various other instances an interest in design through making. And what I mean by that is to make design decisions through the process of making, rather than to think that design is a preload and then making is something that just delivers the design. And there's all sorts of compromises involved there. I'm much more interested in the world of becoming a maker and a designer at the same time. Things that interested us in the early days was seeking verification. So frankly, if you want to learn how to make things in the 1990s, if you wanted to learn how to make things, an architecture school was not the place to go. It was a place to go to feel free in how to represent things through drawings predominantly, moving images, digital images, handmade drawings and so on. But actually the skill in understanding how things were made just didn't exist. There was a lot of model making, but the how to actually make things like a chair or a table, you couldn't find that in the architecture school. Some schools used to have furniture departments in them. Next to them, there was a one-to-one world, not far from the studio of architecture, but certainly wasn't the case for us. So we set up our own workshop in Shoreditch, long before it became the party central capital of London. And this guy, Harry, who his workshop was next to us, he remembered the bombs dropping in the Blitz right next to his workshop. He remembered the Cray twins coming around to collect their taxes. He was someone we found we needed to seek verification from him about what we were doing. So we wanted to make stuff, but he'd been making furniture for 50 years. What he thought of our work as students meant a huge amount to us, more so than, frankly, what our professors said about it, who, didn't know what we were up to most of the time. Very quickly, in around 1999 to 2000, digital fabrication started to emerge. We were by no means the first people to do it, but we were the first in our community to step into it. Both myself and Nick Callicutt, but also later Phil Ayres and Chris Leung and Emmanuel Vercusa, we started teaching in the workshop of the school by choice. We were offered the roles to teach. We said we'd like to teach in the workshop. And there's a whole other discussion there about teaching and research happening in workshops and the contracts that workshop staff are on. We insisted we were on the same academic contract as somebody teaching a unit upstairs, and that also changed the status of all of our colleagues in that space, where information transfer over the production of something being made is such a rich and dense conversation that it often just goes, it gets taken for granted. So anyway, 3D printing and CNC plasma cutting came our way. There were other dimensions to it, links between Nick and Christina Ehlert in Germany. And seeing our drawings pop up on monitors in the year 2000 was quite an exciting moment to see this idea of representation landing on a screen and watching this choreographing, this dancing movement happening on the surface, which was very like drawing, emerge before you. The access to 3D printing came through the medical physics department of UCL, where they were making artificial kind of surgical implants for broken jaws and skulls and so on. And we said, there's an architectural discussion to be had with this technology. And we exhibited early pieces in Acadia in 2004. Around the same time, we were invited to participate in a touring show called Making Buildings, run by the Crafts Council in the UK. And this was our project called The Blusher. As I said, I'm not going to go into it in anything today in a lot of detail, but the Blusher project was an exploration of us making things through digital processes. It was a static steel structure that was assembled in different ways across 7 or 8 different venues up and down England. But it also had this component that's not very clear in this image, which is taken in Walsall Art Gallery, of a responsive skin, which sat behind this kind of mask. It was always fascinating to us what sort of dialogue we would get from the audience whenever the work moved around the country. When we took the work up to the north of England, where everybody would know that's where a lot of the manufacturing happened in the last 150 years or so, you'd hear people coming and going, oh, right, I didn't know architects knew anything about CNC, plasma cutting, and we use that to make suits now, that technology. And it was a very natural conversation. But when the show was exhibited in London in the Crafts Council, we got accosted almost by some members of that community saying, what is this doing here? What is the digital doing in a craft institution? They were actually, they were really, really upset about it. And of course, that's when you know you're doing the right thing. And you upset somebody, you're onto something, you're going, this is special, this is really good. We were then invited by accident again. All of our jobs, our projects and so on, and roles in various ways have come about partially by accident, but perhaps being in the right place at the right time. These was a series of projects called Design Probes, which we were on the back of that Blusher project, and Peter Sharp from the Kielder organisation was in the audience at a talk I gave in Winchester one year. He said, would you like to work in Kielder, which is this very, very large forested area in the north of England? He said, but we have no site, we have no brief, just got a bit of money, I like what you do. Because it doesn't get better than that as a project. I mean, we're not talking about more than, say, £2,000 or £3,000, but to us that was amazing. And we made these responsive structures that we would plant. I know in this image now they make me think of plants and flowers and so on. But these aluminium sheets would expand and contract according to the environmental conditions. And what we were saying there was there's a way in which a brief without any detail in it that may say what is the role of architecture in this landscape could be explored through these sorts of interventions. That conversation moved forward to a more substantial commission from the same people in Kielder, where we were invited to build a shelter in their program of 8 or 9 small projects in that region. Quite a lot of the other projects that have been installed in the landscape came with a narrative or came with a discussion about, say, a program. What we were interested in was remoteness, a difficulty to access a site, those sorts of kind of encounters one has in these kind of difficult landscapes, but also the proximity to the community we talked about a moment ago of manufacturing. So the 5502 project was built in Germany, by which time Nick and Chris had left UCL and gone to set up their manufacturing industry there, which they're still working on to this day. Just a couple of quick key points about that before I get on to the main body of today's talk is the making of 5502 in lots of ways reflected our habits of inverting normal processes. So if you're looking at this image on I'm looking at it on my screen here. So top left, there's a sketch. You might assume that came first. We doodle, and then we model, and then we make it full scale, and then off we go. But it didn't actually. The sketch came around about the middle of the project. The first thing that was made was the photograph with the red background, which was a test piece of metal. It has no meaning, that shape. It's just a difficult thing to make. So what Nick did was he invented this object, and put it out to his staff of about 20 or 30 steel fabricators and said, we're going to do this project. We don't know quite what it's going to look like yet, but whoever is going to work on it with me is going to work on the whole project. And your skills as a welder will be witnessed and evident and be built into the signature of the work. So he asked everyone to make this piece like an exam. And it wasn't like the best one was picked, but the person who had the most interest in the project went forward, and then they contributed too. Next image to the right-hand side of that is a 3D model of a experimental structural form, which started to be made down the bottom left. But at the same time, the central image on the bottom line is kind of a hybrid handmade model and a 3D print of that same object. So at the same time it was being made in Germany, we were making these kind of more traditional desktop models in London and thinking about how we could evolve this project. And then the final, I think, moment that I want to draw attention to without discussing the entire project in detail is this image here of the two steel fabricators who were the two guys we picked, who worked on the entire project for about a year and also assembled it on site in Kielder. They've heated up a 40 by 40 solid steel bar, which is one of the elements in the project. And the only thing that's digital in that image is the jig that's welded to the surface of the table, so we got the right curve. So the digital, the drawing, the sketch, the model, the one-to-one, the representational, they're all in kind of, in a spiral with one another all the time. And that's very exciting, but of course it's not practice. That's not how it works in practice. It's not how it works in Grimshaw's or any of these practices. The workflow modeling is a very, very difficult, more complex, more challenging issue. And there's one of the points I felt like making yesterday is that it seems to me one of the elephants in the room, in a good way, it's not a bad elephant in the room, but one of the elephants in the room is that there are projects, which I'll talk about now in a moment, that are emerging from workshop-based academic environments in a wonderful way to see production happening in the academy. But they're happening in the context of very, very different objectives, very, very different resources, very, very different timelines, very, very different audiences, and so on. And it's an entirely different matter to expect practice to prototype in the same way. So for practice, prototyping is happening in a sense within very tight windows, opportunities of big projects, or if you're highly successful practice, you can invest in a prototyping program. But I just wanted to say about the elephant in the room thing, they're complementary, but they're not the same. And I think this is something we can perhaps some of the PhD students on the Arch Boundary want to get into that. Just want to touch on 3D scanning briefly. We've always been interested in technology as it arrives. So I was called to a meeting one day at UCL by the Dean of Engineering saying the Faro company have donated this snazzy 3D scanner to UCL, and they, for some peculiar reason, have said they want the architects to have 50% access to it. And these guys, is most unusual. Don't know what on earth you would be doing with such a thing. And I went, great, I know just the person. So one of my students had been making a 3D scanner off bits he bought on eBay for about 50 quid. And he came to the meeting with me and I said, you're the expert. I'm going to make this happen. You're going to get access to this. And out of that came a group called ScanLab Projects, who now do a huge number of exciting projects with 3D scanning. But the first thing we scanned at large scale was the Kielder project again, which gave us these evocative images. Of course, the imagery of 3D scanning is very exciting, and the visual and the immersion through the videos that you can get from it very exciting too. But one of the things about it, of course, is it starts to play with notions of truth and time. It twists time, which leads me on to the next project to mention before I kind of move on to FABRICATE. Is a collaborative project I got involved with the theatre company Shunt. This is a company who've done a small theatre company who've done some very exciting projects in London. One was called Tropicana in the archways underneath London Bridge Station. And the second one was called Dance Bear Dance, which was a theatre performance between two arches underneath the railway line in Hackney, the railway line that goes into London. And they play with the notion of live and theatre, this immersive experience. But we got them involved in a project with the Central School of Speech and Drama. And we were using 3D scanning to start to overlay one's sense of compressions of time and memory and distortions and the reveal of theatre. So just wanted to illustrate there that my interest and the interest of the group and also of my students has often, drifted away from the moved from the very obvious things about buildings made of stuff to the technologies of representation, the technologies of manufacturing, and so forth. I want to pay tribute to those students who I've worked with for many, many years. One thing that we've always used to do is take portraits of our students in their places of production. Some of these places of production are a little bit mythical and made up, but they're conveying a message at the end of the year of the students starting to take ownership of this idea of I make things here, and this is what comes from it. When I became the director of the Bartlett School of Architecture in 2014, realised it was 2 years away from the school being 175 years old, so we looked back into its history. As those of you know, I know some of you in the room know the school very well in that time. It was a very exciting school, but a lot of it, the attention was on that time, not on the school's history. So even myself, who was there before Peter and Christine arrived, didn't know much about the school's history. And this phrase, wandering in a labyrinth of experiments, came from the first professor of architecture at UCL, Donaldson, and that's how he described education. And I think this is something which popped out of the blue in a way that year, but it made sense of everything else that had been going on. And I guess that takes me on to the point that I'm interested in cycles. And one of the things that when we look at the FABRICATE books is that they don't necessarily go in a linear, progressive line. There are certain cycles that occur, and that happens to a school as well. Schools dip and they rise through various different themes. This idea that it's a labyrinth is very exciting. So, hope this works now. I just wanted to show you, you may have seen this video already, and I'm just using it as a kind of a prop to talk about interdisciplinary education and research. It's a 3D scan of the before and after installation of a space in East London called Here East, where the Faculty of Engineering and the Faculty of the Built Environment, but particularly the School of Architecture, but also the School of Construction and Project Management, now called Sustainable Construction, we came together to build this space of a footprint of about 3,500 square meters, but with mezzanines and so on, it's almost 6,000. Lots of you will know the Cedric Price Fun Palace. Lots of you will know notions that have been discussed in architectural education and research for the last 30, 40 years of having a space at large scale where you can do large-scale testing, but also you can have barriers broken down between disciplines. I'm just popping that into this talk at this moment to make that point, is I think we're at what an exciting time for various, all the disciplines that are in the AEC sector, but particularly in relation to architecture and engineering. So thinking about the fact that we've been there for, if I come back to the video again, you've already seen that, yeah. Engineering is just as old as architecture at UCL, and we've launched our first ever joint degree. So it's kind of weird that it took 175 years to do a joint program with engineering, which you would think is the first place you would do a collaborative conversation with. So yeah, we're kind of always interested in messing around in workshops, technology. We're pretty good at drawing, but writing was not something that 16 makers ever imagined getting involved with. But Nick kicked it off in 2001 with his book, Computer-Aided Design for Architecture, Computer-Aided Manufacturing and Architecture. If you're not aware of that book, particularly if you're on this PhD program, I really recommend you look it up. You won't be able to get a physical copy, I imagine. They didn't print that many. If you do get one, well done. The top line is stuff that I've been involved with. My world is very much in the world of editing. So I've edited 4 editions of AD and also got involved in the InnoChain book, Design Transactions, which I think is a very close resonance to Archmanu. I want to draw attention to Phil Ayres' book, which came out in 2012, Persistent Modeling. So Phil, as you might know, some of you, is in Copenhagen with CETA, with Mette Thompson, But this idea of persistent modeling is something that Phil articulated in a very clear way to make sense. So writing, in a way, for us as makers and designers was came along to make sense of instinct and intuition, but also to introduce reflection. But for me, particularly with the role of being an editor, is to bring other voices into this space and bring other conversations. So we're going to get into the talk now, and I'm going to try and cover 5 books in 50 minutes, if that's all right. Yeah. I'll try to do it even faster than that. So I'm calling the talk Fabricate Constructing Architectures. I've not given the talk before. It's a bit of a mad thing to do, to try and go through all 5 books in less than an hour. So it may not work. It could be a complete disaster, this idea of just skimming that amount of work so fast. But I'm hoping it's of use particularly to the PhD candidates on this program and your team of supporters, in the sense that obviously all of it won't be of interest to you, but maybe some of it will be. But I think the skim, the fly through, might also start to talk about things we haven't noticed before. So I'd be very interested to get your feedback too. It might turn into something next year, this idea. So, but what I think it might bring out in the presentation is the movement of ideas and projects between institutions, between industry and practice, between academics and PhD candidates and students. And then, because we've been going now for about 15 years, we are seeing papers come into Fabricate that are picking up on research that was done, say, 10 years ago, but now taking it much further forward by doctorates that had been witnesses to earlier work. So just to give a sense of the scale of it all, when we started this, we didn't anticipate it running for more than once. So I'll talk about that again in a moment. But now at this stage, those are the numbers. There's quite a lot of people involved. There's quite a lot of kind of spread, in a way. It's very important to make the point that this is a conference model. So work is submitted through a call, it's peer reviewed, and then it's published. But we only publish 32 papers per book. And we only invite 16, half of them, to present at the conference. So your typical conference will have 200 to 300 submissions, and ours is the same. That's quite a serious kind of cull, down to 32. And it's not good. It's not because there are only 32 good papers. There's always a lot more than that. But the point is, you don't want to overwhelm the space with too much material. You want to focus on particular things. I think you might see, as we fly through these images, there's some projects you go, oh, I saw that before, didn't I? I saw there's something emerging here. So you will see iterations. But I want to make the point that only 83% of the contributors, of the 536 or so contributors, are in one publication only. 12% are in 2. So it means, and so on and so on. So it means there is quite a lot of new material and new contributors happening in each edition. I also just want to make this point to make it absolutely clear as we're going through. I'm going to have the credits for each piece of work on the screen as I'm going along, but I'm not going to read them all out. They're there, you'll see them. It's all available to you in the books and online. While I mentioned the online thing, I'm not going to drop out of this presentation now and go into our website. I thought I would, but we tried it earlier. I thought, no. That's just going to slow it down too much. You can do that yourselves. So if you pop into fabricate.org, I'm not sure, I don't think we've really sold this point well enough yet, is that we have archived every single full paper in fabricate.org as separate JSTOR papers. So if you go into our website, it's lots of news. You'll see the schedule, the announcements, all that kind of stuff. You'll see the links to the videos that we've just put up. But also I would encourage you, if you feel inclined, is to go into the title called Archive. It might be better to call it Papers. Tell me what you think. But in Archive, you'll see all the years broken down, and all the papers are available in their full unedited kind of version. In in 2010, 2011, we put out a call for FABRICATE. There was no theme. We thought it, as I said, it would be a one-off. We thought it was just something to acknowledge, a moment in time. And it was called Making Digital Architecture. All the themes of the books come after we've received all the submissions. And it was very, very much thought that it would just be a one-off. But the structure of it seems to, fortunately, have been thought through in such a way that it became sustainable immediately, with a bit of work, a bit of thinking, but we certainly didn't think it would run for 4 or 5. The structure is very, very simple. Like I said, with the number of papers that get published, but also the sequence of the conference is always very simple. As 8 papers a day, 2 keynotes a day, 2 days. It's easy to kind of concentrate on it. But also the way in which dialogue emerges through it. So right away, the very first edition, we thought each of the keynotes who would not be invited to write a paper for the book, because keynotes are pretty busy people, and they like to write their keynotes at the last minute. So the keynotes would be interviewed about 3 to 4 months before the conference by session chairs. So as you can see here, we partnered up Matthias and Hanif, and their conversation was very much about speed and pace. There's a phrase in it that they talk about over and over again of slowing down, that they thought the pace of activity in the world of digital design in the 90s and early 2000s was moving quite fast visually, but by bringing in digital fabrication and CAD and CAM coming together, it was important to recognize a need to slow down and think about what this meant for practice and the profession and expertise and so on. There's a wonderful conversation between Mark here, Mark Berry and Mark West on Gaudi, on the genius of that work, and speculation, how one can speculate on such small amounts of evidence into such broad conversations about construction and fabrication and modeling. Philip and Michael Stacey talked about Acadia 2004, which was a very important conference for FABRICATE, where digital fabrication exhibition took place. And then Neri Oxman and Sean Hanna developed a discussion around material intelligence. So in this very first edition, what I'm going to do for 2011 and 2014 books is I've gone back over them, reordered them a bit into themes that kind of consolidated a bit further down the track. So 5 books, it appears they didn't have a call with a theme, but then the theme emerged when the 32 papers were identified, 4 chapters were identified, and so on. But going back to the first one, there were just 2 chapters, academic and practice, which is a very binary split. I think it's an opportunity now to go back over it and think, there's a different way those projects can talk to one another. So for the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to talk about the projects in the first edition under a number of themes that I think run through. And the first one is design and constructional tools. So I've picked out 6 projects here from the 2011 edition of FABRICATE. And at the very top, you can see there are projects that are emerging out of TU Delft and Michigan. They're talking about the shift in schools becoming places of production and research. So one of the themes that started to emerge in that time, 2010, 2011, is that schools were investing in equipment and spaces. On the next line, there are two projects that talk to one another. One of them is by Phil Ayres in CETA, and the other was by Peter Webb at the Bartlett. Talk about notions of material performance and craft. One is inflatable steel structures, the other is extruded clay components. And then the bottom line are two projects that talk about practice. So Scan Labs emerging at this time as 2 graduates of an architecture program getting into 3D modeling, but not necessarily clearly working in practice, but all their work is architectural, so it's a new form of practice. And then Amanda Levette Architects talking about the impact of digital fabrication on their philosophy, one that, of course, relates back to their wonderful drawings and their history and Jan Kaplicki's influence. But the words that are discussed an awful lot in that project are the need to kind of keep the role of the designer grounded in relation to new technologies. So there's an interesting way of looking at those projects that start to talk about digital fabrication arriving, what it meant for notions of craft, a kind of a craft revival, but also notions of efficiency or bespoke, and the shift from the manual to digitally assisted processes, what all that kind of meant for the stuff that kind of comes out of practice and comes out of research academies. Continuing in that vein, there are projects in this edition that harp back to the traditions of the experimental machine. So Gordon Pask, Bill Mitchell, John Fraser, labs and workshops in schools of architecture, the fab bots that Marta has produced, and the CNC catenary projects being developed with Rory Glynn and his students at the Bartlett. We're talking about making devices that talked about the behavior and responsiveness of spaces and the making of things. Another range of projects, the two in the middle, start to talk about a spatialized instrument, a highly bespoke fabrication by a student of mine called Misha Smith, who made this, took a piano apart and reconfigured it and installed it in the Slade School of Art. Couldn't have done a project like that just a few years previously. And then the work of Nat Chard, just to the right of that, if any of you are familiar with Nat Chard's work, his idea of machines that explored the production and making of drawings through the material of ink and paint and so on. And then there's the projects that talk about systems design, and here we got the examples from Skylar Tibbets and MIT, notions of structures and discrete modeling and systems. So what we were kind of seeing in this early iteration was a fascination and excitement, which was about redefining things that were made, but also practices and identities. One could pick these two projects out and kind of say at that time, if one was to regard FABRICATE as a slice, a narrow slice through activity, what you should say, I'm not a historian, I'm not presenting the history of the last 15 years, though not many historians are presenting the history of the last 15 years. But if one is to look at that on the left, there was an interest amongst an engineering community around precision, around assembly, around kind of the magic of seeing things emerge, with such extraordinary kind of elegance and refinement. And then from the architecture community, if one was to take Cloud9 and, as an example, the media ICT building in Barcelona, of projects that started to talk about their own performance, monitoring their environments, monitoring their use, but still, using conventional forms of construction, but thinking of the building as being this adaptable, malleable environment. There's a group of projects still in this theme of design and construction tools. We're getting to see industry and practice thinking of the production of buildings in a different way. So the Galaxy Soho project in Beijing, many of you might have seen it. One of the challenges that Cristiano Ciccato talks about there is the contractual arrangements in Beijing at that time of a project of that size. They were not allowed to have one main contractor. They had to have four. There happened to be 4 towers. And the challenge is, if everything has to look like it's made by the same people, how do you get that kind of precision and consistency running through the project? Still a huge challenge for practice. And still, Cristiano is one of the most articulate voices in that space around that challenge. There'll be lots to show from design to production, so we'll come back to their work in a moment or two, but there's another example of Villeneuve by Cloud9, which is looking here, I suppose the debate going on here is the one between customization and mass production. That we saw this come together at this particular time. and we're reviewing that, to kind of jump forward now to 24. A lot of these projects and questions are being rethought and re-critiqued. So the second theme, I think, that relates to that edition is one of material innovation. We're seeing here projects that started to talk about, say, new materials coming in to the palette of construction, but also very standard, well-known materials, timber, steel, concrete, and so on, being carried and manipulated and reconfigured through new processes like digital 3D printing and so forth. Here, of course, as we all know by now, the work of ICD in Stuttgart, there was a series of pavilion projects that have been on a most extraordinary trajectory. I've got the most immense respect for everyone who's been submitted their work to FABRICATE and their commitment to the research questions that they're kind of wrestling with. And what we're seeing here in this research pavilion by ICD and ITKE is a notion of material performance, understanding the way in which materials would react in space and time, rather, in a way that's reasonably well predicted, as opposed to what we were used to in the past, and certainly the way I was educated was to hope for the best. So there's another bunch of thoughts that emerged looking back on this edition is about collaboration and interdisciplinarity. The two projects at the top are two different separate investigations on the same project, the Jean Nouvel Louvre in Abu Dhabi, the making of a very large model to represent the very large roof, and also the making of digital models to explore the digital environment within that shaded structure. On the bottom left, there's a project from Aarhus School of Architecture, and just to draw attention to this, one thing that emerged was this became a practice. So they Osborne and Gele met in 2011, and they went on to do lots of projects afterwards. So there's an enterprise, I suppose, component to this. Bottom right-hand side, there's Foster's doing work at Loughborough University into 3D printing in 2010, large-scale 3D printing, which illustrates that not every practice, but some of the big practices were starting to develop and commit to conversations with the specialist research labs. And then there's an obvious conversation around sustainability and efficiency. So in 2011, although it wasn't the headline conversation, it is now, but there was certainly talk about the world of digital fabrication bringing in the potential and possibilities for greater efficiency in the making of structures. So whether that be the use of materials or in the weight of materials or the performance, the structural performance of materials or the minimal surfacing of structures and so on. These to me are talking about sustainability and efficiency, but in different ways, but they weren't articulated like that in 2011. Okay, so I move on to 2014, and just dropping back into the anecdotal for a second. ETH, as we all know, is an extraordinary home to research in this field, being a world leader, and they came right up to us at the end of 2011, said, "We'd like to host the next one, please," and we said, "Fine, go ahead and do that." So we kind of handed it over to them as a franchise. I wasn't involved in the 2014 edition of FABRICATE directly, but learned from that and made sure I was involved in them all after that. So it almost gave the baby away with the bathwater. They did a brilliant job of it, and they had so much funding. It kind of upped the game, which is wonderful. But the interesting thing about 2014 was it starts to raise what are your motives for a conference? All of a sudden you've gone from being a workshop making designer, teacher, educator, and so on. Now you're kind of convening a conference, and that becomes a kind of a major part of your career. And what are your goals? For me, the goals in FABRICATE have always been to kind of break down the barriers between industry, practice, education, and research. That's it. That's as simple as I can put it in a nutshell. And to talk about collaboration as being the main thing that we all exist for, and to get more and more discussion going about the interrelationships between both. In 2011, we were quite simplistic about it, just saying it's academia and practice. But in 2014, Fabio and Matthias really started to focus in on how universities, particularly their own, but also Stuttgart and Michigan and others, were starting to define research labs in ways that we had not seen before. Certainly, not for 20, 30 years in those institutions. So a new group of keynotes being interviewed by the previous year's keynotes now. So we felt important to us at this stage to bring in notions of history and timelines. So Mario Carpo was the keynote there, interviewed by Matthias. Akeem was keynote interviewed by Philip. Virginia and Ronald interviewed by Neri Oxman, and then Neil Gershenfeld interviewed by Mark. One of the points about having dialogue in the book isn't just for practical reasons of giving the keynote that amount of time to kind of, think about what they want to say and have this preload of an interview as a warm-up act in a way, is I've always believed in dialogue being, one of the greatest components of the production of the built environment that's undocumented. And my mentor, Steve Gorak, taught me that in the 1980s. Think about the amount of discussion that happens on a building site that is to make a project actually come together, but it's not documented. What happens if that discussion's not there? So it came up here yesterday about AI. I think Jane asked the question, and that just that triggered that thought in my mind about how conversation might be captured in different ways with AI in a way that captures things that were always there before. So it gets away from this kind of fear factor. I'm going to stick with my kind of reconfigured titles, because the titles for the 2014 book make sense if you're holding the book, but don't completely make sense if we're just presenting it now. So I'm going to look at these again through notions of design, construction tools, and speed up a little bit, and just because obviously all of this is available to you to dive into yourselves. Obviously in 2014, you weren't a proper School of Architecture if you didn't have an orange thing that moved around, and now there's a lot of them standing there, scratching their own kind of heads and so on. To me, a robot in a School of Architecture is still a very exciting thing. It's a tool that defines a point in space and time. So you can do what you like with that. It's just a moving point. You put a cutter on it, or an extractor, or deposition, or subtraction, or a drawing, or a camera. Do what you like with it, but it's just this thing about space and time, and it gets us thinking about movement and time in an exciting way. But as you can see here on this collection of projects, there's just this kind of ballooning of questions that these brought about. Some of them, people were thinking, that's a bit mad. Where would you go with that? Building buildings with drones. Well, we all know where the whole world of drones have gone, and their strength and their power and their kind of numeracy, and some of the very, very dark sides of the use of drones. But there's in terms of what was bubbling in 2014, were notions of assembly, using robotic arms to assemble things that are quite difficult to assemble otherwise, or like to get rid of formwork or get rid of false work and so on. But also cobots, conversations between things, how robotic arms can start to pull and push in different ways, and one starts to get into the mindset of a choreographer, as well as a designer and so on. So there's a really interesting bunch of papers in this edition that are all just asking questions, actually. So if you haven't dipped into it, I would just urge you to look at this group of projects here. Questions emerging from the practical side, but across academia and practice. Again, one of the very, very strong voices in the entire series is Design to Production, Fabian and Hanu. And if you want to just track their projects alone, I think you'll cover a huge amount of ground in how they, as an organization that was involved in the production of timber components for buildings, have always raised and delved into the question of data production and the tools, the digital tools for making buildings, and they are incredibly self-critical as an organisation, and I think there's an immense amount of benefit to be had just looking at their work. Then there's another group of projects in material innovation in 2014. Looking at fairly conventional materials, but reconfiguring them in different ways. Clay, bricks that might become, infinitely variable. And of course, all these ideas were surfacing and emerging. Improving the efficiency of the energy efficiency of walls and building envelopes, silk skins. And meshes, for bespoke reinforcement and so forth. More material innovation emerged in that time, looking at even the immaterial. So Ryan Luke Johns, top left. Ryan was at MIT and also I think at Harvard somewhere. But he started to look at the immaterial, and his organisation, Grey Shed, were looking at augmented realities. In 2014, that other organisations have kind of grown from that ever since. And then in the bottom row of projects, there's anti-gravity 3D printing and lightness and fibre systems, working with the X, Y, and Z axis in CETA. Collaboration and interdisciplinarity. The Bloom project, led by Elisa Andrzejczyk and Jose Sanchez, got into the world of gaming and participation and self-assembly. So I don't know if any of you in the room here have any of these pink pieces, but they did get around the world quite a bit, like little yellow ducks that, in the Atlantic. But that started to, raise very fascinating conversations. And even in London, I know that I went to 3 or 4 events where this project was being assembled by kids and different scenarios. Bottom left, ScanLab started to collaborate with environmental researchers in the Arctic about the ice cap and its diminishment. So, 3D scanning starts to shift very, very quickly into monitoring change in the environment in a very provocative way. Sustainability and efficiency. 2014, we saw a series of projects that really started to look at some in some cases traditional methods of construction, or even quoting historical kind of concepts where one would embed structural design strength where it needs to be. So there's a whole conversation about muscle construction in the world of making bespoke materials and surfaces, and also again in the bottom right, the greater development of this notion of material computation. The Hydroskin project by ICD, starting to talk about very, very fine, breathable kind of apertures in skins. And then sustainability and efficiency to do with the deployment of systems. There was a discussion, the discussion yesterday about Autodesk modeling. Of course, everyone in the room would know Robert Aish, I'm sure, and his work, the Topo Facade project. If you've not read that, that's a very key piece for Robert, where he's talking about design script. I've had fascinating conversations with Robert Aish over the years. When we built the 5502 project, for example, he came up to us afterwards and started asking Nick about the geometry of some of the forms. Because he said, I recognize those for the days he worked in shipbuilding in Gdansk in the 1980s. So his knowledge of digital modeling is enriched by his initial training in the Royal College of Art and then working in the shipbuilding industry. So he has huge amounts to talk about there, as I'm sure many of you know. Bottom left, the paper by Dirk Krolowski at Rochester Carver and Partners talked about the extraordinary logistics of building the cheese grater in London. That building had no other space other than its own footprint for the construction. So if you don't know that project, it's a fascinating one to talk about the logistics of getting material to site in a city that has extremely kind of anxious issues around public space and street space and so on. It's changed even since then. It might be easier, it might be harder to do that project now, but I find that fascinating. So 2017, one of the things that happens about people are, how do we pick the next FABRICATE? It's usually a conversation that emerges at each one, and we've always been very excited by how many organizations are interested in having it. But to move it to Stuttgart in 2017, to this kind of, the industrial heartland of Europe in a way, it was deliberate. It wasn't just kind of tap into the work of the great laboratories in the university, but also to look at the industry around the city and to get those conversations occurring, to get industry to come into the community, into the room, and to talk about the potential that the design community we're seeing in the technology they're using on a day-by-day basis. Wonderful conversations that are occurring again here with this idea of dialogue between keynotes, particularly for me, the one between Carl and Akim around modeling and fabrication. 100% American keynotes, by the way. I don't remember us discussing that, but that's how that worked out that year. And there has always been this conversation between Europe and other parts of the world about centers of excellence and centers of development. So I'll just scoot through now the having established those kind of reconfigurations of the first two books under digital tooling, material innovation, sustainability, and collaboration. I'll just stick with the titles in the books from here on in and just pick out the projects that I think are worth maybe digging into in relation to the Archmanu project. So I won't talk about them all now. I'm just going to pick out one or two at a time. I'll pick out the diagonal ones here, the top left, the piece at Hook Park called Infinite Variations. The image itself is very clear. What they're exploring there is the notion of the machined versus the raw, the cooked versus the raw, and there's a wonderful series of projects now that are emerging in Hook Park, led by Manuel Vercusa and Kate Davies, around the harvesting of that resource with materials that would otherwise be regarded to be waste, being used for temporary structures, and all of the kind of investment of knowledge that's emerging from the skills associated with that. And then maybe the bottom right-hand side is the Maggie Centre, the Hospice for Terminal Cancer Patients by Foster's, looking at lightness and precision and off-site fabrication and on-site assembly. So a really, really rich band of discussion to happen there about fabrication that's happening when you could literally be standing on the site and can see the raw material, to being on the site and the raw material is many miles away. There are a bunch of projects here that are dealing with skins, whether they're surfaces or skeletal skins. But the one I want to draw attention to on the bottom right-hand side is this notion of cobots, process without a form, this idea of assembling points in space and structures that are emerging by the knowledge of how these two components meet at ETH. Materialization, rethinking materialization. CETA produce wonderful projects on a regular basis that start to talk about lightness and materiality and growth and form. Here is a piece that talked about the manipulation of a standard material, sheet metal panels being reconfigured in terms of their performance by sheet forming. And this is the altering the behavior of standard materials by precision modeling, either deformation or by cutting or from perforation. There is a whole series of other conversations that emerge around the lightness of material and the lightness of hand in the use of the material. So top left-hand project from Michigan talks about the design and manufacture of surfaces and forms and skins that are fibrous in nature, how one understands that at the design stage, being completely kind of different to the stage of physical reality. And then there's a piece below that by Chrysler Associates, which talk about large fiber reinforced polymer panels, looking at the aerospace industry, looking at building codes and restrictions of the use of certain materials, and trying to resolve solutions for the envelopes of fairly large structures. I'm not going to get into the whole kind of discussion about the history of 3D printing, and there's plenty of people do that, but throughout the entire series of 160 projects, it is a very recurrent theme of different scales, from the scale of 3D printing components through to 3D printing very, very small, kind of jewel-like elements, which in themselves are like dust, to the bottom right image by Gilles Retsin, which started to shift away from notions of continuous surfacing into discrete modeling, and that emerges in the next FABRICATE as a whole discussion around the potential construction of low-cost housing. So many rich conversations to be had by looking through just 3D printing across these books. Again, there's a discussion in this chapter around the use of fibrous systems and materials, where it gets us back into robotics and filament production and weaving, lightness, and getting rid of formwork. So in the final section in 2017, there's a conversation around constructing logistics. Here, I'd like to just draw attention to the conversations that bubbled up around the minimal reconstruction of a material. So just kind of gentle reforming of materials. And I think you see much more of this in the more recent FABRICATE. There's an abundance in the kind of early days, which is completely, in a sense, understandable about pulling every trick in the book with every project, you know. But what we're seeing, I think, this cluster here starts to kind of indicate the shift, is let's reduce the amount of tricks that each of these elements each of these projects are trying to play with, and start to talk about the consumption of energy in the production of a large-scale project. So design to production, top left, the Scène Musicale project, very, very rich conversations to occur there around precision manufacturing and assembly of components. So I'm going to speed up and get through to 2020. This is the event that was supposed to happen in face-to-face in London, got cancelled because of the pandemic. So maybe it didn't get the kind of exposure that we normally see. But here there's a very, very distinct shift. In 2020, there's a very distinct shift from previous projects into discussions about what materials we're actually using, what materials are we consuming. So what you'll see here is the emergence of mycelium and clay, raw clay, the ubiquity of access to clay, in the same way that, say, Kate and Emmanuel are talking about access to off-cut timber in a wood and so on. So there's the bottom right-hand project, the Cork House by CSK Architects and Matthew Howland, a building made, the external structure and envelope made entirely of solid cork. Biomateriality from discussions that are occurring around not just the physical material itself, but self-shaping materials. So again, like I said, to reduce the amount of processing that we're applying to materials, to think about ways in which we can just alter the performability of materials. But some of these discussions, like the top right-hand project by Urbach Tower by Stuttgart, again, arcs back to traditions and knowledge in boat building, and so forth. The conversation occurs again around the emergence of new types of practice and construction, synthesizing materials and processes, but thinking about, say, the designer being someone who is concerned about the tool path of production. Certainly wasn't a discussion I had when I was educated as an architect. Think about you could design just by thinking through the tool path of your fabrication system. I'm sure you all know the Deep Fab House in ETH starts to talk about the challenge we have of assembling, radically different kind of components, each of these discrete conversations. So it was wonderful to see that organization attempt to bring it all together and talk about the workflows of these various different strategies. In optimizing for a changing world, we start to see Kagome weaving being presented by Phil Ayres for the first time, which goes up to a much greater scale. Very bespoke notions of 3D printing, which came out of the Interchain project, bottom left, which takes further this question of designing strength in specific locations to augment material performance. And this group of projects here looking at, there's a continuous conversation about the elimination or reduction of formwork and false work in the production of surfaces and forms and environments. Right at the end of 2020, we have a series of projects that are talking about performative practice, call it collaboration, if you wish. But the two I want to draw your attention to on the bottom there is this discrete modeling conversation, which starts to think about a very much more modest way of thinking about the use of these materials in terms of designing components that can be reconfigured to provide architectural solutions potentially for low-cost constructions. In this group of projects, there are also conversations of just-in-time fabrication, all the challenges that we saw maybe as on the back of the pandemic even, when we get work, supply chains getting disrupted, conversations that occur around notions of availability of time, of materials on time. So on to the last one. This is all available for the first time now as videos, so you don't have to rely on just the book and me talking here today. You can go and watch the videos for the 2024 FABRICATE, which we call Creating Resourceful Futures. It was hosted in Copenhagen by Phil Ayres and Mette Ramsgaard Thomsen. I just want to draw your attention to their own work, which I think it's always been important to the chairs of the conference are what their work represents to the community. But this was, again, another gear shift. We've always been reluctant to put the call out with any particular theme, but with climate change and with scarcity of materials and with quite profound crises emerging across the industry, 2024 clearly responded with a much more focused call and set of requests and demands, which were brought out in the keynote talks, which I would encourage you all to have a look at, particularly the one by Anders Legner, who kicked it off on circularity, making buildings from existing buildings, and Indy Johar on his kind of quite sombering summary and discussion about just the effect of the kind of behaviours of the human organisations that we all operate in. So these projects, we were starting to see some projects that appeared earlier on in the series become quite mature and complete as systems. I just draw your attention to the bottom left one here, the long-range project from Michigan to talk about glass as a malleable surface material in relation to acoustics, and above that, a very exciting new presentation from Northumbria University, Living Manufacturing, where they're growing materials in collaboration with people like Phil Ayres for potential use in building construction. The Live Mats biometric shell, bottom right, I think Alex mentioned it yesterday, that and starts to talk about the entire kind of challenge of putting complete projects together like the DFAB building did in EH. The 4 themes for these final chapters in this book were very direct, single-worded themes to provoke the discussions that brought this different breed of conversations forward. So I think there's a very noticeable shift. The bottom left-hand project is the idea of cutting up buildings that are being demolished and reusing them. But also the top right-hand project, also from CETA, which is the reconfigurable of timber waste components for structures. Fascinating conversation that occurred with the top 2 projects, but also around this notion of circularity and reuse. Making projects far more reconfigurable and far more reusable. The integration of technologies and development of different forms of manufacturing capabilities are illustrated in this final group of projects. The projectile concrete structures on the top left, lightweight formwork on the top right, integrated prefabricated components on the bottom right from Braunschweig, looking at embedding multiple performances within the building component. Let's look at this group here and think about the materials that they're starting to talk about, but particularly top right, this pavilion by IAC, which is taking 3D printing in clay and testing it out at the level of it being needed to sustain an enclosed environment. So I think what you've seen, hopefully, in the course of this quick talk, this fly-through, is the challenges that we see in practice of resolving projects to the level of providing us with habitable spaces, with spaces that endure over time, is being taken on by the research community that's associated with these conversations. And then the final group here, I think, the design to production wisdom, to me, illustrates as an amazing kind of journey for that practice to have come on. If you think back on the first projects they presented, then the Scène Musicale, then the smart building, to think about just large-scale minimizing prefabrication, large-scale deformation of timber structures, timber components on site to produce these sorts of forms, to me, strikes me as an organization that's really taking on board the challenge of reducing its energy footprint. On the right-hand side, Filair's Kagome, large-scale Kagome weave, is installed in the Louisiana Gallery in Copenhagen, in Denmark, starts to show the potential for a very ancient traditional craft to prevent possible environmental enclosures and so forth. So that's the rapid trip through all the 5 projects. bit of a mad thing to try and do, but I hope it just kind of offers you a bit of a banquet, of material. The conferences now, there's been so many of them. The website's becoming quite rich place to tap into, and if it's of interest, this is certainly the kind of world which I'm interested in engaging with the Arch Manu community with, and seeing, is that material represent provocations, examples, errors, failings, successes in relation to the challenge that you're taking on, which I think is of immense importance. I think I'll just stop there, if that's okay. I had a couple more, but I'm going to stop. Thank you. Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Bob, for that tour de force through the FABRICATE world and your own world. We've got time for one question, so if anyone of the audience would have one question.
Where's the coffee?
Where's the coffee? Well, for the ones who've been asleep, the front row really offers you a good phrasing experience of the air conditioners provided here in the space. Tim, you've got one.
Maybe one observation, one question. one of them is, I mean, they've been really remarkable conferences. We spoke about it, on the side yesterday. One thing I noticed over the years is, I mean, for me, one of the amazing moments was in ETH, I think it's a cheese grater, when they talked about this really large-scale fabrication of steel and the kind of challenges of practice.
Yep.
And there's always been this, you presented this presence of practice. It seems though things got a bit smaller, I think, as the years continued. And I was wondering if you maybe had some observation around that, maybe just how things have shifted in practice. And the other one, of course, is giving all that reflection. What do you think will be in the next one?
Okay. Well, look, one of the things about FABRICATE is the initial submission step is fairly straightforward, and I don't want to say the word easy because but it's compared to a conventional academic conference. It's designed to be as attractive as possible to practitioners, and it's just a simple fact that academics are in we all work terribly hard and it's all that, but we're in a very privileged position compared to practitioners, in that practitioners do not have the time to give up a week to write a paper that may or may not get accepted in a conference. Forget it. It's just not going to happen. So the initial submission process is 600 words and 12 stonking images that, is kind of saying, trust in the literacy of the peer reviewers to read this material in its potential to become a paper. And then if you're selected, you'd be invited to write a paper. So, but that doesn't mean you still have whetted the appetite of the practitioners. So I think you're right. I'd love to see projects get bigger. I'd like to get the community to broaden and diversify. I think 2024 was quite significant. 2020 going online was obviously a bit of a wobble, and getting it back on the road in 2024 was quite a confidence-inspiring experience. I would like to see the projects get bigger or more diverse and so on, to talk about cities, to talk about even shipping of materials from place to place, all sorts of things. Where it's going to go next, I think it can't go back. I think there's some things that I think have had quite a good run, shall we say, and right and deserve the kind of attention that they've been given. But I think we want to see in the next FABRICATE almost entirely new projects that we haven't seen before, from perhaps parts of the world that have been underrepresented as well. And that's just not me being politically correct or anything. It's me thinking that's the place where we haven't looked hard enough at, and that there's extraordinary conversations to be had there. So certainly think the conversations that have already started about the next FABRICATE will be looking at the social conversations that occur in the construction and maintenance and development of built environments, but the participation involved in making things but also maintaining things. So I got quite interested in maintenance recently, which is not something I've really spent enough time thinking about before. And so maybe that'll be a shift. So I think this year has given us a lot of encouragement to make the next one, which, every one could be the last one, but to make the next one quite radically different to all the others. Yeah. Thanks for your question, Tim. Hope to see you there. Yeah.
I didn't give Tim the microphone to stop the conversation.
Yeah.
No, I didn't want to do that. But we have to move on to our event. Bob is around at lunch as well, so for conversations about the FABRICATE conference and the project you've seen. Thank you very much for your keynote.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.